So hey folks, welcome to the Digital Debate Center. Today we're going to be covering the environmental justice 1AC as well as the spending disadvantage. So for those of you who may not know, today the year's topic for policy debate is protection of water resources in the United States. That's the general resolution, but as with any affirmative, we're going to propose a specific plan. So the plan is the United States federal government should substantially increase its protection of water resources in the United States by fully funding a program to remove lead contamination from drinking water. So that's a lot of words. So what I want to break down is a couple of keywords. The first is the United States federal government. The federal government is the federal government, obviously, right? Located in Washington, D.C. That's opposed to the state government, which traditionally has focused or had control over municipal water sources. So when water comes out of your tap, odds are you're paying your local city or state municipality, right? They control the water. Our argument is that the federal government should step in and take control via increased regulation and increased funding. The second idea is this idea of protection of water resources in the United States. That's the goal of the plan, right? What we want to do is we want to ensure water resources are protected and they're free from contaminants. This is the language of the resolution, right? So we want to achieve the goal of the resolution. The third thing is fully funding a program to remove lead contamination. So lead contamination is obvious, right? Lead is a neurotoxin that can be found in drinking water, can be found in older buildings, can be found in older pipes, and it disproportionately impacts people of color and impoverished communities. The idea of fully funding, though, says that current proposals aren't giving enough money. Instead, what we should do is we should fully fund a program and essentially not write a blank check, but ensure that if we're going to remove lead pipes and replace them, then we do it right and we don't put a financial cap on what we're trying to do. So to kind of walk you through the different components of this 1AC, the first part of any affirmative is inherency. Inherency, remember, is what is happening now in the status quo? What is the problem that exists? The piece of Snyder evidence that this 1AC contains makes a couple of different arguments. First is that right now there's a bipartisan infrastructure deal that just passed the Senate, right? So the Senate agreed to a bill that would invest in the nation's infrastructure. The problem, though, this evidence argues, is that it only contains $15 billion for removal of lead pipes and to remove lead contamination from drinking water. As the evidence says, the legislation won't come close. As a result, the $15 billion that the president has proposed or agreed to in the Senate bill is less than the $60 billion that the drinking water industry says it would take. Now, the idea of full funding comes from this last sentence. Without full funding, the low-income communities where lead lines are more likely to be present are apt to end up on the short end of the stick. So as a result, what we can conclude is that there's currently an initiative to have a program to remove lead pipes and decontaminate drinking water. The problem is that money is not sufficient, which is where the plan comes in with the idea of fully funding. So let's talk about the advantage. An advantage identifies a problem in the status quo and explains why it's an important thing to solve. So there are two pieces of evidence here that we want to work through. The first is the Kazan evidence, which says that the lead crisis in Flint, Michigan was not unique. Millions of Americans are drinking unsafe contaminated water. It's a public health disaster. Now, this piece of evidence makes a couple of different arguments. First, it says that Flint, Michigan, which was a widely publicized lead water crisis, where residents of the predominantly people of color in Flint, Michigan had high levels of lead in their blood as a result of poor water practices by the city. That is not a unique circumstance. That case garnered national attention, but the same thing is happening in Newark. The piece of evidence cites specific numbers and says that that approximately 5.5 million Americans get water from systems that exceed the EPA lead action level. In other words, millions of Americans are drinking contaminated water. Now, what's the reason for this? Well, the piece of evidence says that it is a result of a serious failure to upgrade water infrastructure. In particular, many of our pipes in these areas are 50 or 100 years old or more, and many of them are lead. What's the public health impact? Well, The piece of evidence concludes by saying that there's a huge public health impact. In adults, you can have kidney and heart disease. In children, can permanently lower IQ and lead to behavioral problems. You can't reverse the damage, and it can last a lifetime. So what's the impact? We know there's a public health crisis, and we know it affects 5.5 million Americans. The Kalala evidence says that ultimately, lead poisoning creates a cycle of poverty. And the reason for that is impoverished people who are more likely to drink water contaminated with lead end up having problems related to their health and development that make them unable to face or conquer many of the challenges that those populations face. So in particular, it says it's an environmental injustice. The idea that something is not fair about this situation because it perpetuates some of the worst issues these communities face. For example, the evidence quotes a study that says a child's life and chance of success can be vastly decreased if they are poisoned with lead. They are 7 times more likely to drop out of school, 6 times more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system. As a result, the piece of evidence concludes that the larger issue of lead poisoning in Black and low-income communities is an injustice greater than any individual act of racism or prejudice. So to take a step back, we started off by saying that there was a lack of funding to resolve the issue of lead pipes in predominantly urban areas and urban drinking water systems. We then said that it's a public health crisis that affects 5.5 million Americans. This piece of evidence is an impact argument. It says why it matters. If you remember Mr. T, magnitude, risk, and time frame, well, the risk is 100%, right? It's happening now. Time frame is also right now. Magnitude, instead of talking about a global war or something like that, this piece of evidence is making a moral argument that because there's something fundamentally unfair about lack of equal access to safe drinking water, the United States has a moral obligation to solve this problem. The evidence concludes by saying that lack of concrete solutions is a conscious disregard for the health, safety, and livelihood of low-income minority communities. It's about recognizing that there is a problem, recognizing that there's a lack of fairness, and doing something about it. So let's talk about solvency. Solvency is exactly what it sounds like. We've identified a problem that there's lead poisoning that disproportionately affects poor individuals of color. We've identified that current solutions don't fully fund programs in order to solve the issue. So what do we do instead? Well, the Filippelli evidence makes a pretty clear distinction. It says that Biden's infrastructure plan sounds pretty good. The problem is in the math. So Flint, for example, Flint, Michigan, it's a relatively mid-sized city. The estimated cost of replacing all of the city's lead service lines is about $50 million. Okay, $50 million. Remember, the original bill in the Senate has about $15 billion. But the problem is there are thousands of US cities to fix. Some, for example, are way larger than Flint. So Indianapolis has a population of 850,000 people. That's 10 times as big. So that might mean that it is 10 times as many households, 10 times as many water distribution endpoints. So maybe that costs $500 million. And all of a sudden, the original money that was given, $15 billion, doesn't seem like that much, does it? So the evidence concludes by saying, in fact, we don't even know how big the problem is because we don't have accurate maps of where the lead pipes are. So as a result, we need to fully fund the program. We can't just say, oh, $15 billion and hope that it solves the problem. We need to commit and make an investment in water infrastructure in order for this not to be a problem ever again. So to conclude and kind of wrap up, there's a problem, right? Poor individuals of color are disproportionately impacted by lead in drinking water, particularly in urban areas. Current proposals, the inherency argument, only allocate $15 billion in the Senate bill to solve the problem. That's not enough. Instead, to solve the issue, we should fully fund a program that commits to getting all the lead pipes out of our water supply so that there are never any future water crises. So now let's talk about the spending disadvantage. So the affirmative makes a moral argument, right? That says, there's a problem, we're not fully funding this program. And instead what we should do is we should commit. We should make a huge investment in our water infrastructure. The negative says, well, actually, there's some pretty bad consequences to spending that type of money. So let's go through these different kind of arguments to respond to the affirmative. Just to remind you, a structure of a disadvantage, we start off with uniqueness. Uniqueness is the idea of what's happening now. Generally, the negative will argue that what's happening now is a good idea because the negative thinks the plan is a bad idea, right? The negative defends the status quo. The link explains what changes. What does the plan do? In this case, the plan spends more money, right? An internal link explains how we get from the link to the impact. The impact is the bad thing that ultimately happens. So a disadvantage says everything's good right now. The link says, hey, here's how it changes. The impact says, here's why that matters. Here's why that there is a negative consequence of the change of the plan. So the idea of a spending disadvantage relies on some economics. And this is going to be, I think, the most challenging part. So let's go through some ideas of some economic ideas, and then we'll talk about specifically how they apply to the disadvantage. So we have a federal budget, and that federal budget is very similar to your household budget, right? You know, your parents or your guardians or you make a certain amount and you budget how much you can spend based on that. If you make 20 bucks, you can spend 20 bucks. The problem, though, is that there's this idea for the government of deficit spending. Imagine that you only make 20 bucks, but rent's due and you got to pay for your car and you got to get groceries. So you take out a loan. You are now at deficit spending. You're spending more than you make, which for most people is not that great an idea, right? Because then you get yourself in debt and you have to pay it back. But countries have a little bit more credit or more ability to take out loans than they would normally think, right? So the United States federal government engages in deficit spending. They borrow money from the treasury when there's a deficit. They sell bonds to other folks, which are basically guarantees saying, hey, we'll pay you a certain amount over time if you agree to purchase some of our debt. And this all leads to inflation. Right now, the US is approximately $29 trillion in debt. That's a huge amount. The argument of the disadvantage is that if we continue to deficit spend, to spend money that we don't have, our currency will decrease in value, right? Because if everyone has a ton of money, that means prices on goods are going to go up. So the basic idea is there's a budget. Currently, we're spending more than we have by taking out loans. And when you take out too many loans, you have to create more money to pay off the loans. That leads to inflation. Your currency becomes less worthwhile. So that's probably pretty confusing. Let's take a specific look at the arguments of the disadvantage in order to kind of break it down. So our first piece of evidence is a unique link from Egan, July 21st. This piece of evidence makes the argument that the status quo is good, and second, that the plan results in a negative change to the status quo. So the first argument that the status quo is good says that currently Biden's big Build Back Better agenda, you've heard about his infrastructure bill that's bipartisan. You've heard about his broader kind of social safety net spending. All of those things will help the economy, right? They'll help the economy get back on its feet. But there's a crucial caveat, there's a crucial condition. The reason it's a good idea is because the Biden plan is paid for by taxes and various other fees, et cetera. The problem is if we were to engage in more deficit spending, then inflation would happen. Why? Because there would be more of our currency. We'd take out more loans, and then we'd have to print money to pay off the loans. So let's look at our internal link. Remember, the internal link is how we get from the link, that negative change to the status quo, which is deficit spending, spending money we don't have, to a negative consequence. The piece of Cox evidence says that what happens when we deficit spend is we get ourselves into a problem. Let's say you make 20 bucks, you take out a loan for 30 bucks, all of a sudden you're in debt, right? You're $30 in debt. But what can you do if you're the government? Well, you can give yourself an extra 30 bucks, right? You can just print more money. The problem with that is then people say, hey, you're printing all that money. There's more of it now, which means you can afford to take out a loan of $100. And it keeps increasing and increasing and increasing until You're just printing money and your currency isn't valued as much. So why does that matter? Well, there's this idea of hyperinflation. Inflation, the currency isn't as valuable. What are some examples of why that matters? Well, Weimar era Germany, basically pre-World War II, at one point, currency was so worthless that a loaf of bread cost more money than you could put in a wheelbarrow. Zimbabwe in 2007 to 2009 period, if you've seen pictures on the internet of the $1 billion bill, that's because you can't, $20 of Zimbabwean money didn't really mean much, right? So what does the government do? Well, it prints $1 billion bill because that's the type how valueless the currency is. And then Venezuela currently, its currency isn't really worth much. That means it can't buy things. So what's the impact? Well, the impact, remember, is the ultimate negative consequence of the plan's change to the status quo. So the Liu evidence makes an argument that economic collapse or economic decline risks war. And there are a couple of arguments. First is that the 2008 to 2009 crisis already hurt the system, right? Our economy remains vulnerable. The things we did in 2008 to 2009 to fix the system and help people, we can't do anymore. Second is that economic distress leads to negative sentiment towards outsiders. The P7 cites research by Harvard's Benjamin Friedman to say that those attitudes can fuel unrest, terrorism, or even war. Other factors that make war more likely are rising nationalism. Nationalism is belief in the superiority of one's country, and political polarization, the idea that there are two opposite sides to politics. So against this background, the evidence concludes we must take seriously the possibility that the next economic crisis could lead to large-scale military escalation, precisely because it would lead to blaming and scapegoating of other countries, which could lead to war. So to recap, the basic idea of the disadvantage is that the plan forces us to spend money that we don't have. Just like if you have a job and you make 20 bucks, if you spend 20 bucks, you're all good. If you spend 30 bucks, well, the $10 had to come from somewhere. In the case of the government, it means that the government prints more money so it can pay its debt. That means that your currency becomes less valuable, which means you end up printing more money and more money. The impact of this is global conflict because ultimately, as the US economy declines, it will scapegoat outsiders for its problems and lead to conflict. So that's all I have for today. I'd be happy to walk through any part of the disadvantage or any part of the affirmative to answer questions.